If you like your theology hot, caffeinated, and stimulating, pour yourself a second cup of your favorite beverage and sit down with me, Keith Giles, as we explore topics like hell, the second coming, biblical inerrancy, women in the Bible, deconstruction, penal substitution, and so much more. In the brand new book, Second Cup with Keith, available now on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Damn. It's time for another Drinks and Deconstruction, this time with Juliette, a Catholic deconstruction. Juliette, thank you so much for being on the podcast and agreeing to talk about your deconstruction with us, because, you know, I find that for me, a lot of times I don't fully know, can't fully process on my own stuff like this. And it really helps to hear other people's story to understand my own story. And so I am so thankful for you. But, you know, we are recording this during the day. But, you know, this sort of episode, we call it Drinking and Deconstruction. And so if we weren't in the middle of our workday, what is the relaxing drink of choice for you in the evening?
I make my own homemade limoncello.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah,
That
so
is great.
nice couple shots of limoncello, some fresh mint from my garden.
Oh, wow. Fresh mint. Yes. No, this is great. I definitely want to have some if we're ever in the same area. That sounds fantastic. So yeah, you know, I wonder, kind of just to start in right where you are right now, what seems to work for you today? I know that like that might change in an hour, but as far as like spiritual beliefs or spiritual practices, like where you are right now, what feels like, yeah, I can hang my hat on that. Like that's something I can say is working for me right now.
Yeah, and I can kind of get a little bit more into this distinction as I kind of talk about my deconstruction.
Mhm.
But the way I view faith is there's two parts. You have
Uh-huh.
God himself, and then you have the
Okay.
institutional body of Christ, whether it's your
Okay.
church, just your community, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah.
And right now I'm just really focusing on my relationship with God himself
Uh-huh.
and trusting in his providence, a
Okay.
higher power bigger than myself, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And kind of ignoring the institutional body of Christ at the moment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No,
Um,
I think the institution is a source of a lot of people's pain and trauma. When you say you're focusing on your relationship with God, what do you mean? Like, what does that mean for you right now?
I think the biggest thing that's been on my heart, especially the past year or so, is
Mhm.
learning about myself and learning
Yeah.
about who God created me to be, kind of my own
Okay.
purpose in the world, how I experience the world.
Okay.
And it's really kind of breaking through some of the more societal or religious expectations that I was kind of brought up with,
Yeah.
kind of just picking apart what that looks like and
Hmm.
just learning how to view myself in a different way.
Right.
Just kind of starting just I don't want to say starting small because personal identity is a really big thing.
Right. Right.
But using that and just my own experience as a stepping stone for how I fit in
Mhm.
the larger world and like what my purpose is and
Yeah.
allowing God to encounter me there.
Yeah. How, like, practically speaking, how does that work for you right now? Like, what do you do? What feels like, no, this is like, put that in like actually like action terms. What do you feel like that is for you right now?
Right now, it's spending a bit of time outside and enjoying nature.
Okay, great.
Um, I find so I really enjoy fishing. And so
Okay.
just going out in the boat and fishing, I found to be really spiritual, especially at sunset.
Oh yeah.
Uh, kind of enjoying nature in that way, but also like the biblical context of like Jesus's friends were mostly fishermen and like
Yeah. It feels like you can
uh
connect to the story in a new way.
yeah,
That's
and
cool.
knowing that Jesus encountered a lot of his disciples in that place too.
Cool. So let's rewind then. And, you know, I wonder if you're sort of thinking back to where things started to unravel for you uh with church, God, whatever. Um, can you find like where did that start for you? What was going on in your life at that point?
Yeah, so I think there's three kind of periods where like major deconstruction happened or
Okay.
started anyway. The first was my sophomore year in college. I was studying
Mhm.
abroad.
Okay.
Uh,
Where, if you don't mind asking.
I was studying in Rome.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And I love Rome. There's a piece of me that will always be in Rome.
Uh-huh.
Um, however, my program was living in a very intentional Christian Catholic community.
Okay.
And my group tended to be a bit more traditional than I was
Hmm.
practicing.
Hmm.
Um, and I felt like there was a lot of judgment if you didn't follow the expectations they had.
Right.
Um, and so Catholics believe in adoration, and kind of bringing the Eucharist up front and doing some prayer with that.
Can you
And
explain that? A lot of people might not understand what that means.
yeah, so Catholics have communion, it's called the Eucharist, and the
Hmm.
host is kept in
Which is the bread, right?
yep, during Mass.
Okay.
A communion wafer, the host, has
Hmm.
been kept in a like a gold box called the tabernacle.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes those extra hosts will get pulled out and put in a big, usually gold, um, like display called the
Hmm.
monstrance. And
Yeah.
then Catholics will go and pray in front of it and be in the presence of Jesus.
Okay.
Because for Catholics, communion and the Eucharist is Jesus himself.
Right.
I take the this is my body very literally.
Right. And you said something about adoration.
Yes. And so, like, just for example, this intentional community that I was living in, we had adoration every Monday.
And
Uh,
adoration is for those people who don't aren't familiar with that term.
yeah, so adoration is putting the communion host into the monstrance and having it on display for
Okay.
prayer.
Great. Great.
Yeah. Um, and so I personally really enjoyed adoration. I think it's a really good time to do like just some meditation.
Hmm.
Um, I've kind of started to do a lot of like mindfulness and just grounding just in that space.
Yeah.
But prior to that, there's just a lot of expectation of like I'm going to reverently like say all these prayers and sing
Hmm.
the songs in Latin correctly and all the
Right.
things. And if I didn't, like if I wasn't singing or if I didn't go, or if I was too focused on, writing in my journal, there's a lot of
Right.
judgment.
Mm.
I felt from a community and like no one ever actually said anything.
Right.
But just kind of like the looks or like if I didn't go, people would be like, oh, like we missed you in adoration today.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it made the whole thing feel very forced. And I think that's kind of the summary of my experience in that community.
And so
Um,
so that felt kind of forced. And then what did you start questioning? Like what was what kind of deconstruction bloomed from that moment?
so then at that point, I started questioning just the people in the church
Okay.
and like, is this an expectation that God is putting on me or that people are putting on me?
Oh yeah. Okay.
Um,
And it was
and then
the
that
sort
kind
of
of spiraled. So I kind
expectations
of
of
found
the
my own groove. Like I don't have to be a traditionalist Catholic.
right.
Um, like I can. the only thing we have to do, right, is attend mass once a week.
Uh-huh.
Anything else is extra. And so kind
Right.
of finding my own, like, where I connected God. And if I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to go to adoration, great. If not, like, that's my choice, right? And I have
Mm-hmm.
the freedom to discern that. But then several years later, in 2020, when COVID hit,
Right.
just seeing a lot of like my church's reactions to the virus and COVID itself, and then bringing Black Lives
And
Matter,
what
and
were they? So what were the reactions? Like, how did people react and how did that make you feel?
it was very dismissive of I felt like it was dismissive of human dignity, right?
Okay. How?
Um,
What were they doing? What were they saying?
like protesting, wearing a mask, you know, like talking about like it's the mark of the devil if you get the vaccine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
or like the COVID shutdown is the devil's ploy to keep people away from church.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
and I very much so like believe in personal choice. Like if you discern for yourself that you don't want to get a vaccine, like that's your choice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to blame others and like say that they're following the devil if they choose to do so,
Yeah.
that was very off-putting for me. Or like same with wearing a mask. Like, oh, you're
Yeah,
just
for
being a
sure.
sheep. Like you're following the government and you're
Wow.
not living an authentic human life. But for me, like I was taking care of my grandparents and I was
Yeah.
working in a homeless shelter. So I'm
Yeah.
not going to take whatever like I catch from the homeless shelter to my grandparents.
Right. No. Wow. That's intense. And like that's not just like people not wanting to wear a mask, like tying it to the devil. And that's a whole other level, right?
Yeah. Like
And
you're
so
opening
when you
yourself
heard
up
that,
for
like
position.
what did you what were you so prior to that, you started to detach the expectations of people from the expectations of God, right? And I think by people it sounded like both the people that you were living in community with, but also sort of the church, the sort of institution. And now the institution and people are tying taking care of others by wearing a mask and getting a vaccine to the devil, right?
Hmm.
What do you even do with that? Like I mean, obviously, it feels like that just ratchets up that kind type of deconstruction, right? The God versus expectation of God versus people, like takes it to a whole other level, right?
Yeah, it definitely did. And I think the hardest part for me is that, like, something that I still very much so connect with my Catholic faith even now is the
Mhm.
belief in human dignity and
Yeah,
that people are made in the image of God and people are dignified simply because they exist, right?
right.
And I felt like that really just went against that and wanting to
Yeah,
protect others and keep people safe. And
yeah. And so you were doing that, and it sounds like you actually did show up at gatherings with a mask. Like what did people say? Do you remember any specific interactions or any moments where you walked in and what people said or did?
people would question like, oh, like you don't have to do that here. We're not woke here.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that was you walk in with a mask and all of a sudden you're woke.
Yep.
I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm really happy if you're woke, but that was the sign for them. And being
Yep.
woke, it obviously is not a positive thing,
No, no, that is like you're following the ways of the world and you're not following God.
right? And then so I mean, what is that? Who defines that, right? Who was it that told them that the mask was the devil and that not the mask was God?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like preachers on social media. I personally
Hmm.
didn't follow any of them.
Right.
But like I saw people like repost things.
Yeah.
Um,
So they were receiving that from sort of authority figures in Christianity.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and when they said that to you, like, what did you do? Like, what did you say?
So initially, like, it kind of worked, like, with the shutdown. Hold on, I'm
Uh-huh.
gonna pick up my dog here.
Oh, that's great. What's your dog's name?
Her name is Tank.
That's wonderful.
Um, she wants to play, but hopefully I can get
So
her to
cute,
stop
little pug.
whining. Um, so the shutdown really helped because I could, like, physically, like, remove myself.
Yeah.
Um, and then there was a local pastor who I can kind of bring up later, or I will be bringing up later.
Yeah.
He really stepped out and was like, I'm hearing my parishioners say that they want to still be involved. So I'm
Hmm.
gonna do everything I can to do things in a safe way. So
Okay.
like he had us do like adoration from our cars.
Cool.
Um, and I really appreciated that and like just the intentional balance of like we still want to gather in community, we still want to worship, but we
Cool.
can't do things safely, and it doesn't mean that I'm a woke liberal.
Right. I would hate to think what they would call me if they stumbled onto our little TikTok community. Okay, so yeah, so what sort of beliefs came into question at that point? Like what were the things that were sort of unraveling for you then?
Again, it was the further connection to the church community,
Yeah.
and especially how Catholic values were being lived out. And so
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it actually really made me dive deeper into tradition.
Okay.
Not in a traditional Catholic sense,
Hmm.
like I had been pushed away from previously, but kind of going
Right.
back like to the catechism and just
Okay.
going to the bare bones of like we believe this because like Jesus showed us to uplift like how to uplift humanity. And
Right.
that is the root of the faith.
Right.
And just learning to be really intentional and like serving others
Uh-huh.
is the best way to live out those values and putting the dignity of people first.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Um, so so you let go, you went back to the catechisms, but what did you find there that seemed to be in opposition to what you were experiencing in the rest of your life?
I felt like people weren't listening to their own conscience.
Hmm.
And so there, I couldn't give you the exact like section,
Oh no,
but there's
yeah.
a quote in the catechism that talks about like there are things that are like doctrine that you have to follow, right?
Hmm.
Like the Ten Commandments.
Right.
But there's a lot of nuance that is
Hmm.
explained in the catechism. The
Right.
catechism itself isn't full on doctrine. There's
Okay.
like different levels to it. And so it says like if you have a well-formed conscience and like you dive into like what morality is and how the church like expresses it,
Uh-huh.
ultimately follow your conscience above all.
Okay. That's interesting. I love that.
That's
So
really freeing for me.
what'd you say?
That was really freeing for me to have
Yeah.
permission to have opposition to what my church community was displaying.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So the well-formed conscience and uh so that's interesting. So up until this point you felt like or at least what I'm hearing from you is that you felt like you didn't even have really permission to push back, to think something differently, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I
And
just know like
felt that way
have
because they said
things.
that, right? Right?
And so with that, I entered something called spiritual direction.
Okay, yeah. Can you
Which is
tell people what that is?
yeah, so it's basically just meeting one-on-one with a pastor,
Mhm.
talking about your prayer life and finding ways to dig deeper into your relationship with God it's not counseling where you're like working through your issues.
Right.
Or at least it shouldn't be anyway.
Right.
Um, but it's more of like, hey, like I have these different like roadblocks in spirituality, like what resources can I have to dig deeper,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of overcome some of these barriers. And so at that point, my barrier was like the people in the church. Um, and I felt like I was kind of like learning to trust myself and having the permission to push back, but also
Yeah.
feeling like I was in free fall.
Uh,
And I just wanted something to slow that down.
mm-hmm.
So I started spiritual direction. Um, and that kind of did that for like a year and a half. And that's what led into this third piece that really accelerated my deconstruction
Uh-huh.
and kind of led to where I am now.
Right.
So I was in spiritual direction and came out as experiencing same-sex attraction to my spiritual director.
Okay.
At which point he covertly started doing reparative therapy on me.
Oh no.
Um,
And reparative therapy is very similar to, in the non-Catholic world, conversion therapy, right?
yes. Yeah, reparative therapy is basically conversion therapy for Catholics.
Right.
And so keeping in mind, like I'm digging into human dignity at this point, right? Like that's what's
Right.
keeping me in the church. And reparative therapy at its core teaches that you are not a true, authentic person if you're not living out humanity the way God created it in the garden with basically like heteronormativity, like marriage between a man
Right.
and a woman who have to be
Yeah.
attracted to the opposite gender.
Right.
And if you're not living your life that way, you're not a true, authentic person.
Yeah.
And so you have
Wow.
to repair your humanity.
Yeah. It's so profoundly damaging,
Yeah.
right? Wow. I can't, I'm so sorry that that sort of sacred trust was violated in that way. Like that's awful. And it's funny because this my experiences with spiritual direction, it's like the opposite really of the values of what spiritual direction really is about. Wow. So that happened.
Well, that happened. And I caught on to it pretty quick. I do
Uh-huh.
have a background in psychology, so
Uh-huh.
um, it was something that I was able to pick up on
Mm-hmm.
and ended up having a really big falling out with my spiritual director over it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was just really confused about where to go, whether or not I should report him to the bishop, like all the things.
Yeah.
Um, and so the priest who had been doing like the good stuff during COVID,
Yeah.
had been my youth pastor when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And we both ended up moving to different places, but like in the same direction.
Okay.
Um, and so when I had the falling out with my spiritual director, I called up this priest
Yeah.
and I don't know where
What
to
do I
go
do?
from here.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do? Um, and so I show up to this meeting and I I couldn't even to this day, I don't know what tipped me off.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but just alarm bells were going off. The meeting lasted maybe
Like,
five
as
minutes
you
and I
showed up.
thought, yeah, he showed up.
No, I mean, like
But
when you showed up to the meeting, before you were like in the meeting, you were like alarm bells.
yeah.
You're
And
like, where did the meeting happen?
it happened at his parish.
Okay, so you walk
Not,
into this church
yep,
where your former youth pastor is the priest,
yes.
right? And you walk into a meeting, and who's in there?
Yeah, and it's just him and I, and like I'm
Okay.
super comfortable with him. I've known him for a long time at this point.
Uh-huh.
And just at first I thought that I was having like a trauma response because of
Mm,
what happened in the falling out.
yeah.
But I just wasn't ready to have another one-on-one conversation with a pastor.
Yeah. And so you sort of like
Um,
walked in and you're questioning like, what are these alarm bells? And you're like, is this just like I've had a horrible traumatic experience and now I'm walking into something that feels similar, a priest,
Yes.
you know, one-on-one. Okay, got it.
Yep. And so meeting lasted maybe 5 minutes. I ended it, got the hell out of there, moved on
Hmm.
with my life. Well, about 2 weeks later, the diocese announced that that priest was removed from his post. And a week after that, formal charges of sexual assault were
Oh no.
charged against him. And
Mm.
come to find out, the alleged now convicted event had happened about 24 hours prior to my meeting with him
Oh my gosh.
in
Wow.
that same building.
Wow. Wow. Juliette, that's intense. So, I mean, just that order is amazing. Like, but also there's like something your subconscious, whatever, your spirit, whatever, however you want to say it, was reading that room. And like, so what do you do with that? Like, obviously this kicks off a whole other level, right,
Yeah.
for you. And what is that level? What's going on? Like, what are you processing?
Yeah. So at this point, like, I have no idea, like, where to go from here because
Mm.
now any trust that I have in the institution is gone.
Oh, right.
Like I started questioning the people many years before, but still
Hmm.
had some faith in leadership. And
Right.
now my faith in leadership is completely obliterated. Um, yeah, I honestly still don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah.
Um, I was a volunteer leader for an organization, and I ended up going on a retreat um, while the trial was starting for this
Mm.
priest. Um, and I was pretty upset about it. And so there's a chaplain on this retreat, and I like did not want to talk to him at all.
Right. Yeah.
At this point, I'm like, I am done with priests. Like, we're
Right.
not gonna
Yeah.
go there. Um, and he had pulled me aside at this retreat and was kind of like, hey, like, I don't know you, but something's off. Like, do you want to talk about it? And I was like, well, like, I'm here. Like,
Yeah.
might as well. Come
Okay.
to find out, he had been in seminary with the priest who was arrested. Um, and so he like literally broke down in tears. And I think seeing
Oh,
that
wow.
was so healing for me because it was
Okay.
actual acknowledgement from church leadership that like
Hmm.
shitty things happened.
Yeah. Right. Wow. And so what, obviously, you had this like problem with church leadership. How did that map onto God, right? What how did that affect that sort of spiritual belief system?
It all came crumbling for me.
Mhm. Like
Because
to what level? Like are you saying like I don't know if God exists? Are you saying like I'm can't be a Catholic anymore? Like what are the things?
yeah, discerning my place in the Catholic Church. The big thing is the sacraments of the Catholic Church, so receiving
Hmm.
communion, going to confession. Those are all
Right.
things where you directly interact with the priest, right?
Right.
And I no longer feel safe doing that, but those are also
Yeah.
the places where I encounter God.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and so finding other places to have those spiritual experiences and
Hmm.
have that connection with God. It's
Yeah.
been about 2 years. It'll be 2 years in November when it all started. With the falling out with my spiritual director. And so just piece by piece, just trying to find other places to encounter God. And
Okay.
at this point, like over the 2 years, like my whole theology has changed. Like
Well, tell me
I
some of the changes. What are some of those for you? How you I'd love to hear the before and after.
I no longer believe that people who are part of the LGBT community have to stay celibate.
Right?
I do believe in gay marriage and love is
Right?
love at this
Right?
point.
Right? Love that.
Uh,
Yes.
I I don't believe that hell is as prevalent as people like to
Mm.
think.
What
Like
do
I
you
don't
mean by that? Not as
um
prevalent.
so Catholics also believe in something called moral culpability.
Okay.
And basically Catholics make a distinction between mortal sin, which separates you from God and sends you to hell, and
Uh-huh.
venial sin, which is like a disruption in a relationship with God, but you're not
Okay.
automatically gonna go to hell for it.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what a mortal sin is like it's a grave thing. So like
Mm-hmm.
stealing $1 from your mom's purse versus like
Right.
stealing $10,000 from a bank. Like there's a
Right.
difference in graveness there.
Okay.
Um, has to be a grave matter. You have to know that it's a grave matter, and you have to consent to doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what moral culpability looks at is the ability to truly consent to something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so like getting drunk is a sin.
Okay.
And but if you're an alcoholic and you have that compulsion and it's a disease,
Mm-hmm.
your ability to consent to that action diminishes.
Okay. Right.
Um, and so like Catholics believe that mortal sins, like you are cut off from God, you are going to go to hell if you don't
And they
repent.
believe that happens often,
It could.
right? I mean, just often, not individually often, but like corporate, like nation worldwide. Like there's lots of people who are committing mortal sins and going to hell. Like hell's going to be crowded.
Right. But I think that there's more merit to moral culpability.
Uh-huh.
Like I don't think so like when people sin, they say that they're choosing something other than God. Well,
Right.
if you don't truly know who God is, can you
Okay.
truly choose not him?
Sure.
And that question. So it really like I don't have an answer of like where I sit, but I question
Right.
like the
No.
true prevalence of hell because I don't think you can truly reject God in that way,
Mm-hmm.
100%, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what a lot of people, um, whatever they were taught about hell, that idea of who goes, how easy it is to go. That's one of the big things that people struggle with. If in addition to just struggling with whether or not hell is a real thing, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, so for you, like you had these big things like the becoming an affirming person and feeling like God is okay with that, and the prevalence of hell. I like that was an interesting phrase. And then what else? What else were the before and afters for you?
Um, no, and I just think it also just really reinforced like again that dignity of humanity. Like I just think
Mm-hmm.
that is where we encounter the divine and
Right.
serving others and um
We
interacting with the world in a way that's bigger than ourselves.
so we encounter the divine when we are honoring human dignity. Is that what you're saying?
Mhm.
Oh wow, that's beautiful. You know, it's interesting, Juliette, when I'm listening to you. In some ways, it feels like I hear the story of somebody who has left the sort of traditional Catholic faith, right? And then there's other pieces that it's like you've actually never stopped being a Catholic,
Yeah.
right?
And that's the weird place to sit because like I don't feel like I have safety in the church anymore, but I also
Right.
can't bring myself to say that I'm not Catholic.
Yeah. What is it? What is it about Catholicism? Is there some piece of identity or history or family? Like what is it that keeps you still rooted there?
So I've really been discerning this a lot.
Yeah.
I was actually raised in a split denomination home. So my mom is
Okay.
Catholic, and we were raised in the Catholic Church and received the Catholic sacrament.
Hmm.
But my dad is Protestant.
Okay.
And so I actually like got like the doctrine of his church and read it over the summer. And
Uh-huh.
he comes from a very affirming church. And
Who,
I was like,
which
that
which denomination?
is
Protestant denomination.
Presbyterian.
Okay, great.
And I thought that that could be a more like seamless transition for me.
Hmm.
Um, and I read through, so they have the Heidelberg Catechism.
Right.
And I was like, for the most part, like this checks out for everything except for communion.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
Eucharist is something that means more to me than I thought it did. And it's
Okay,
that
that's
physical
interesting.
encounter with Jesus.
Okay. Yeah, there's when I talk to people who've gone through this process of deconstructing in one way or another, um, in Christianity especially, uh, I think there's a lot of discovery about that happens around communion. If the person just hasn't sort of rejected the whole thing, become an atheist, whatever, um, because communion is this like mystical thing, really in Catholicism and a lot of Protestantism, there is some level of like mystery there. Um, and for you, it sounds like the mystery of it is not something that prevents you from believing it.
Hmm.
Why do you think that is?
I think God is so vast, and not in like an overwhelming, like crushing way, just in like in a way that brings a lot of wonder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I like the idea that God isn't contained just within the church, but I
Mm-hmm.
also like the idea of having that physical, like simplistic encounter.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a dichotomy there.
Right.
Uh, and just
Interesting.
like the idea that like God is encountering me in that moment
Yeah.
as I am.
Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful symbolism, the thought, like all of that is really beautiful. Um, and it's just really interesting to me that in the midst of all of the teaching of the church, all of the stuff that was sort of added to what you've sort of discerned as the roots of Catholicism, that one was not also brought into question, but that sort of was a grounding place for you. So what do you feel like? Do you feel like you are, I don't know, my experience is that once you start pulling at the thread, right, things start to unravel, but eventually you realize, well, there's actually no end to the unraveling, right? I'm pulling the thread on an infinite sweater. And this is, in some ways, this is my life. This is what the human existence is to continually try to figure out what you think and believe and all that. Um, I, I wonder for you, like, where are you headed? Like, if you sort of take all of this stuff from your school in Rome, COVID, the priest friend, the conviction, if that's like a trend line, right? And you plot the next point forward, where are you headed from here, do you think?
I have Elquo.
Okay. Like what, or should say, maybe are there inklings of other questions that you have with you right now?
Yeah, I think my biggest thing is like where I can have like a solid foundation to encounter
Hmm.
God.
Hmm.
'Cause right now, it definitely is still very much so is Catholicism.
Yeah.
Again, like there's a lack of safety there. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't feel like a firm foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so where do you find that? Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that's the journey I'm on right now. Like,
for sure.
I don't have that answer quite yet.
And it sounds like, so if you rewind, like what I've heard from you is like your experiences of encountering the divine seem very tied into what a sort of traditional Catholic would describe as the places, right? In the sacraments and that kind of stuff. Are there other places outside of those things where you feel like you've experienced God throughout your life, or the divine or universe, whatever you want to say?
Yeah. With my like practice with clients and therapy and seeing
Uh-huh.
them have their own self-actualization,
Hmm.
not
That's very
even
cool.
brought on by me, but just the ability
Right.
to witness other people's authenticity.
Yeah. As I listen to you, I hear this like, uh, I don't know, very, it's the word I want to say has other implications, but very carnal, and not in like a bad way, but like very much with people in the flesh, like your experience of communion with the like physicality of it and how important that is, right? With your clients and like sort of being in person with someone who is experiencing that awakening. And even in some ways it sounds like the thing that you're struggling with is an in-person question, right? It's like, where do I go to be next to in the same room with other people, right? And I think I wonder if there's ways to find that feel spiritual um without feeling unsafe, right? And just at the same time knowing that you live in a very rural part of the world, right? And so I'm assuming there's not a lot of options, right next door.
It's really not.
And I wonder also if there's a way that you can create that for yourself. Like, I mean, you're not going to be a priest. You can't consecrate elements, right? But I wonder if there's like a step back from that can still seem holy in your way, right? Um, but that could happen at your at your table, right? Like if your table could be like the communion table, it's just a stand-in for that. I don't know. You just seem like a person who's really that all of that really matters to you.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, do you still go to mass?
Not on my own.
Okay.
If I'm with family or friends, yes.
Okay. Does that feel? How does that feel for you?
It's good with other people. And I
Hmm.
intentionally avoid the churches where my old spiritual director is at.
Right.
He just switched to the parish, but I switched to after
Oh, of
the
course.
fallout, which I'm annoyed by, but
Right.
that's fine. I can start over again.
Yeah. Well, Juliette, I am so thankful that you spent some time talking with us, even though you couldn't have the glass of limoncello. Um, we couldn't share that together. Being able to hear your story, I think, is so helpful. It's also helpful because of, I don't know, it's wonderful to hear the story of someone who was able to feel like some of your roots are still there. You didn't sever all of them at once. Um, yeah. So thank you so much for being on the podcast and being so open. That was very great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Juliette is part of our Not Church community. It's this wonderful place where we explore spirituality together without the judgment that a lot of people have experienced in church, without a lot of the trauma that people like Juliette have experienced. We are there for each other. We talk about spiritual things, about spiritual beliefs and practices that work for us. And we are a wonderful, weird group of people that have all kinds of different beliefs and religious affiliations, but are in it together. If that's something you're interested in, check out $3 on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. You can subscribe and get in. The deal is we don't ask for people to tithe or give us some kind of donations. You just pay for what you get. And if it doesn't work, at some point you can just stop subscribing. So we'd love to have you in our not church community. Patreon.com/skepticpastor. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.